The lock on my son's front door clicked shut with the finality of a coffin lid. Outside, the January sleet wasn't just falling. It was a relentless assault, each icy pellet a tiny needle against my threadbare sweater. At 72, with my life crammed into a single waterlogged suitcase, my own flesh and blood had just declared me a liability. My dignity bled out onto the frozen pavement, washed away by the storm. I felt erased, as if the decades I had poured into raising him had been nullified in a single brutal moment. They thought I would break, that I would simply fade away into the cold, but fate, it turned in, had other plans. When my sister found me shivering beneath a concrete overpass, everything changed. A different kind of storm was gathering, a tempest of truth that would soon rage, and it would leave none of their lies standing. My suitcase hit the asphalt with a wet, sickening thud. Grant stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the warm light of the home I had helped him buy. His arms were crossed, his face a mask of cold disgust. "You're a burden," he had shouted just minutes before, the words striking me with more force than a physical blow. Now, he didn't need to speak. The silence between us was an abyss. I had no place here anymore. I didn't beg. Pride, or perhaps shock, held my spine straight. I picked up my suitcase, its weight multiplied by the soaking rain, and walked. My slippers squished with each agonizing step. Behind me, the door slammed shut. That sound, a sharp, violent punctuation mark, would echo in my mind for days. I didn't cry. The cold had frozen the tears inside me. I just walked, my legs moving on some forgotten autopilot until they finally gave out. I found shelter under a highway overpass, a grim concrete cave hidden from the main road. It wasn't dry, and it certainly wasn't safe, but it was a place to hide. I tucked the soaked suitcase beneath me, leaned against the damp wall, and listened to the hiss of tires on wet pavement. Every bone in my body ached, but it was a dull pain compared to the sharp, splintering agony in my chest. My heart felt like ash. A few cars slowed, their headlights sweeping over me, but no one stopped. To them, I was just another faceless, homeless woman, a stain on the fabric of the city. I felt invisible, discarded, a piece of trash left out in the rain. The wind was a cruel knife, slicing through my wet sweater. I pulled a thin, damp blanket from my case and wrapped it around my shaking shoulders. The tremors weren't just from the cold. They were from the sheer, soul-crushing shame of it all. How could the boy whose scraped knees I had kissed, for whom I had skipped meals, look at me now and see only weight? That night, I drifted in a haze of disbelief, listening to the city's mournful symphony of sirens and distant trains, feeling something vital inside me crack and break apart. Around 3 a.m., the sleep finally subsided. I was just beginning to doze off, my head slumped against the cold concrete, when I heard footsteps. They weren't hurried or heavy, but measured, deliberate. I looked up, my vision blurry with exhaustion, and for a moment, I thought I was dreaming. Standing before me, haloed by the sickly orange glow of a distant streetlight, was Sylvia, my younger sister. Her hair was soaked and plastered to her face, her makeup streaked, but her eyes were a blazing fire of familiar fury. We hadn't spoken in nearly a year. Life, family squabbles, and 1,000 miles between New York and South Carolina had gotten in the way. Yet there she was, a miracle in a trench coat. She didn't speak at first. She just knelt beside me on the grimy pavement, brushed the wet hair from my face with a hand that was surprisingly warm, and held my frozen fingers in hers. It was the first real human touch I'd felt in what seemed like an eternity. Without a word, she helped me to my feet, lifted my heavy suitcase as if it weighed nothing, and led me to her rental car. There were no questions, no judgment, just a silent, unshakable solidarity. I sat in the passenger seat, the heater blasting, A thick blanket wrapped around my shoulders, trying desperately not to shatter into a million pieces. She handed me a thermos of tea. It smelled of honey and mint, and as I took a sip, I felt the first flicker of safety I had known since Grant's door slammed shut. We didn't speak until we were on the highway, heading south. "You're coming home with me," she said, her voice a low command. I simply nodded, too broken to imagine going anywhere else. She didn't need to ask what happened. She saw it in the way I clutched the thermos with both hands, as if it were the only thing left in the world to hold on to. Sylvia had always been fire where I was water. She burned. I endured. But as the miles dissolved behind us, I began to wonder if simply enduring was enough. At a motel just outside the city, she handed me a room key and a bag of clean, dry clothes. I stood under the hot shower for a long time, scrubbing away the grime, the rain, the humiliation. I slept in a real bed. And the next morning, as we continued our journey toward Charleston, something inside me shifted. It was a quiet turn, the moment you realize you will not swallow your pain just to keep the peace. Not this time. Not when it has cost you everything. The next morning I woke in a hotel room to the low hum of an air conditioner. My muscles ached, but my hands were warm. Sylvia was already dressed, moving with a focused energy as if she'd been waging this war in her mind all night. In the car, she handed me a folder. Inside was a real estate listing for a 2-bedroom condominium in Charleston, fully furnished, with a balcony overlooking the Atlantic. The price made my breath catch. "It's yours," she said, her eyes fixed on the road. "I bought it this morning. It's in your name. No mortgage." I couldn't speak. I flipped through the photos. A bright kitchen, a guest room, that impossible ocean view. On the final page was a bank receipt, a deposit into a new savings account. $5 million. My head spun. The numbers on the page seemed to vibrate with an alien energy. "Your savings," Sylvia said, her voice flat. "Yours alone. I've had it set aside for years, a promise I made to Mom and Dad. Now you know." I sat back, the folder in my lap, the coffee forgotten. My ears were ringing. She pulled the car back onto the highway. The world outside looked the same, palm trees, strip malls, but nothing felt normal. Something had irrevocably changed. She drove through a gated entrance into a community of cream-colored buildings with blue-tiled roofs. She parked in a reserved space, carried my suitcase inside, and we rode an elevator in silence to the 3rd floor. She unlocked the door to Unit 3C and pushed it open. Light flooded the room. I walked straight to the balcony and gripped the railing, staring out at the endless expanse of the ocean. It was steady, heavy, alive. Behind me, Sylvia set down my suitcase. "This is where you live now," she said. "I'm in the unit across the hall, so don't get any ideas about disappearing." Her tone was sharp, not sentimental. "I know what he did, Audra. You don't have to talk about it, but you will not let them take anything else from you. Not ever again." She looked me dead in the eye. "And I've already contacted Isla Sterling, Isla, her college friend, now one of the most ruthless and respected estate lawyers in the state. She's drafting the documents now," Sylvia continued. "Financial locks, legal shields, whatever they try to take, we will be 2 steps ahead." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Grant thought he had thrown me away, that I would rot quietly in some forgotten corner. He thought shame would be my silence. He had no idea I was about to bury him with the very truth he tried to steal. 3 days later, Sylvia hosted a small gathering at the community clubhouse. She didn't ask, she informed. About a dozen other residents were there, their warmth a gentle balm on my raw nerves. Sylvia introduced me simply as her sister, here for a fresh start. As I stood by the window, watching the light fade over the water, one of the building's security guards, a man in his late 60s, approached me. "Keep an eye on the hallway traffic," he said in a low voice. "Had a report of someone hanging around the mailboxes late last night. Didn't match any resident profiles." My blood ran cold. Just then, Sylvia raised her glass for a toast. As she finished, I saw her eyes flick to the door. I turned, and there they were. Grant and his wife, Chloe. He wore a freshly pressed shirt. She was dressed in beige and gold, her smile as artificial as the silk flowers on the table. My stomach clenched. Sylvia walked straight to them, her posture a wall of steel. I couldn't hear her words, but her expression was unmistakable. They were not welcome. Grant looked past her, at me, and smiled that easy, empty smile, as if he hadn't just left me for dead in a winter storm. I said nothing. My hand gripped the table's edge so hard my knuckles turned white. After a tense moment, they turned and left. Later, as Sylvia walked me back to my apartment, she said grimly, "I told you they'd come." She had seen a comment on one of Chloe's social media posts, something too specific to be a coincidence. Sylvia was already 3 moves ahead. Alone in my new home, I sat on the couch, the sound of the ocean a steady rhythm outside. They hadn't come to apologize. They had come to scout, to see what they could still get. But they knew now. I was not where they left me. I pulled out a new notebook and wrote a single sentence across the top of the page. "What they took, they will return." Underneath, I wrote 3 words: house, name, power. The stage was set. They thought they still controlled the story. But I had the pen now, and I was going to write the ending. 2 days later, Sylvia arrived at my door with a stack of papers. "They're going to try again," she said, her voice clipped. "But this time, it'll be legal." She had hired a private investigator. The findings were chilling. Grant had been making inquiries about power of attorney transfers. Chloe had been messaging a mobile notary. "They think you're soft enough to sign something if they come in crying," Sylvia said, her eyes hard. That afternoon, we staged our own little party. A few neighbors, coffee, and pastries. Sylvia told the concierge to let Grant and Chloe up if they came. She placed a tiny recording device under a lamp on the end table. They knocked less than 20 minutes later. Chloe held a gift bag. Grant smiled his politician's smile. After 5 minutes of shallow chatter, he leaned forward. "I brought something for you to look at," he said, pulling a stapled document from his briefcase. "Family wellness and property agreement." My heart hammered against my ribs. I read the first page. Buried in the legalese was a paragraph authorizing Grant to manage all my medical and financial decisions. Sylvia stood, retrieved a folder from the kitchen, and laid an identical document on the table, this one with a red line through it. "This is a copy of the version you had drafted last week," she said to Grant, her voice dangerously calm. "The original email is time-stamped." Grant's face froze. Sylvia turned up the volume on the recorder. "I want everyone here to know," she announced, her voice ringing with clarity, "that this document was designed to strip my sister of her financial rights under the guise of assistance." The neighbors fell silent. Paul shot to his feet. "You're making a scene," he hissed. Sylvia laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "No," she said. "This is clarity." She nodded at me. I stood, picked up the contract they brought, and tore it in half. The sound ripped through the quiet room. Grant stared at me, and for the first time in years, I saw fear in his eyes. "This," I said, my voice steady, "is what happens when you mistake quiet for weak." They walked out without another word. The next phase of their attack was a campaign of emotional warfare, an orchid on my doorstep, a bag of food from my favorite restaurant, a framed photo of Grant as a boy, I ignored it all, but I documented everything. Every visit was recorded. Every conversation circled back to the same themes: bills, accounts, end-of-life planning, the language of thieves disguised as caretakers. Grace, the lawyer, found their next move. Grant had tried to change the mailing address on my bank correspondence. We changed the mailbox locks. That night, the fire alarm was pulled. Then a man from a so-called elder planning group knocked on my door. They were trying to build a narrative that I was unstable, vulnerable, incapable of managing my own affairs. If they couldn't make me sign, they would try to prove I couldn't manage. I didn't feel anger. I felt a cold, sharp focus. I went back to my notebook and made a list, 3 columns. What they tried, what failed, what will never be forgiven. I was no longer defending. I was preparing. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, slipped under my door. 6 stapled pages claiming that for my own health and safety, they were filing for a conservatorship review. They had evidence, it said, of my mental decline and erratic financial decisions. I didn't cry. I laughed. Then I called Sylvia. By noon, Isla Sterling was at my apartment. "They want to scare you," she said, her tone dismissive. "This isn't about your health. It's about control." That same week, I booked a full cognitive exam. I passed with flying colors. I had Isla send a copy of the perfect results directly to Grant. A week later, we discovered they had tried to list themselves as co-beneficiaries on my savings account. Chloe had called the bank, posing as me. The bank's security protocols flagged it immediately. They were getting desperate, and their desperation was making them sloppy. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about erasing me. It was about proving they still had power over me. Isla and Sylvia arranged for my accounts to be legally sealed with third-party oversight, with everything designated to move into a foundation upon my death. A foundation I had already quietly established weeks ago. The trap was set. The invitation for dinner came via text. "The kids miss you. Let's start fresh." I knew it was their final desperate gambit. I arrived at their house wearing a simple navy dress, carrying only a slim envelope. The dinner was a performance of strained cordiality. Then, over dessert, Grant made his move. "I was wondering, Mom," he began, "if we could review some of the decisions that were made, especially regarding the estate." I reached into my bag. "Of course," I said, sliding the envelope across the table. "But I think it's best we're all clear." Inside was a notarized addendum to my will. It detailed the irrevocable establishment of the Audra Vance Foundation. It confirmed that my home, my accounts, my entire estate were legally tied to it. The beneficiaries were a scholarship for single mothers over 60 and a care fund for victims of elder abuse. Paul's face went stiff. Chloe's smile shattered. "What you lost," I said, my voice quiet but unshakable as I stood to leave, "was trust, and I don't hand that out like dessert." Their final act was one of pure, reckless arrogance. They filed a motion in court, claiming I had granted them power of attorney over the foundation. They forged my signature on a series of documents, backdating them, even inventing a board meeting that never happened. They made a mistake, a big one. The notary they claimed had witnessed the signing had no memory of it. A forensic examiner confirmed the forgery. The metadata on the files showed they'd been created just days before, not months. They hadn't just lied, they had been lazy. Sylvia filed a counter-motion for fraud and perjury. Because the foundation dealt with elder welfare, an automatic review was triggered by the district attorney's office. It was no longer a civil matter. It was criminal. I arrived at the courthouse early, a quiet observer of their downfall. Isla laid out the evidence, the forensics, the witness, the contradictory timelines. It was irrefutable. The judge dismissed their case and referred the matter for criminal investigation. Outside, Grant approached me, his face pale and drawn. "I didn't think it would go this far," he muttered. "That's the thing with lines," I told him, meeting his gaze. "Once you cross them, you don't get to decide where they end." Formal charges were filed: fraud, forgery, attempted misappropriation of non-profit assets. Chloe left town. Grant was left to face the ruin he had built. He never called. There was no grand apology, just a legal settlement releasing all claims, a final act of silent surrender. I hosted a gathering at the community center, not a victory party, but a celebration of resilience. I stood before a room full of women my foundation had helped and spoke my truth. This was about refusing to be erased, about proving that the second half of a life can be the most powerful. One morning, walking on a trail, a young mother stopped me. "You're the woman who fought back," she said, her eyes welling with tears. I smiled gently. "No," I said, "I just refused to vanish." That afternoon, I planted 3 new apple trees at the edge of my yard. Planting something you may never harvest is an act of belief, not in yourself, but in the world that will come after you. My story wasn't about winning a war. It was about the quiet, unyielding power of a woman who had been underestimated for the last time. It was about reclaiming not an inheritance, but a life. And in that life, I finally found peace, not a peace that was given, but one that was earned, tended, and grown in the space where I had refused to be buried.